right, the Rules Committee will come to order. We are here to meet on two measures, both important to the American people. First is the Senate amendment to H.R. 5833, a bill to keep the federal government funded through December 16th. Look, it's simple. We in Congress have a responsibility to keep the lights on and our government running. The last shutdown during the Trump presidency, the longest in our history, cost our economy an astounding $11 billion. This legislation ensures no American loses access to vital government services while we finish negotiations on the longer-term fiscal year 2023 appropriations bill. In addition to funding the government, this legislation provides Ukraine with the security, economic, and humanitarian assistance they need to fight Russia's brutal invasion. It also contains more money to support communities across the U.S. as they recover from floods, wildfire, and hurricanes, extreme weather events that are a result of the worsening climate crisis. This is a bipartisan proposal. It earned, well over 60 votes. I forget, in the Senate, including the support of Minority Leader Mitch McConnell and members of the Senate, Democrats and Republicans. Understand that it's our job to prevent the shuttering of child care and other services for military families, the stalling of small business loans, and the furlough of federal employees. I hope that all of my colleagues will join and pass this when it comes before the full House tomorrow. The second bill we will consider today is H.R. 8987, the Fairness for 9/11 Families Act. This measure delivers catch-up payments to thousands of 9/11 families that were unfairly excluded from receiving compensation from the U.S. Victims of State-Sponsored Terrorism Fund. The continuing resolution and the Fairness for 9/11 Families Act are good bills that should pass with flying colors. At this point, I'm happy to turn to my ranking member for any comments he wishes to make.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Today's hearing covers two items. The first I'll discuss is an item that arose on very short notice, H.R. 8987, the Fairness to 9/11 Families Act. This bill would move $3 billion from the CARES Act Small Business Loans account to the United States Victims of State-Sponsored Terrorism Fund. Regardless of how one feels about this topic, and I know everyone in this room has strong feelings about supporting the victims of the 9/11 terror attacks, it's unconscionable for the majority to play politics by bringing up this bill on such short notice. As we will hear from my Republican colleagues on the Judiciary Committee, Republicans have repeatedly engaged with the majority on this topic and have been more than willing to work with Democrats to achieve a just result for the victims of 9/11. And yet, with no notice and no markup in the Judiciary Committee and no indication prior to today that this was even a possibility, the majority is now bringing this bill straight to the Rules Committee and then onto the floor, violating the so-called McGovern rule in the process. The majority is once again making a mockery of regular order. At the last second, we are being asked to review legislation without the chance to consider it in committee, without a CBO score, and with nothing more than the majority's insistence that it is necessary to pass this specific bill today. And for what? For cheap political point. The victims of 9/11 and their loved ones deserve better than a cheap political stunt, Mr. Chairman. My colleagues on the Judiciary Committee, who are more versed than I am on the policy questions, will have more to say on this bill, and I look forward to hearing their testimony. For now, I will note that it's this process that's shameful and unbecoming to the gravity of the matter. The second bill is the Senate amendment to H.R. 6833, which is a continuing resolution funding the government through December 16, 2022. It's unfortunate that we are only discussing this bill now, 2 days before government funding expires. Once again, the House is leaving until the last minute, something which could and should have been considered earlier. And now, instead of the House and the Senate Democratic majorities negotiating full-year appropriations bills or even a top-line agreement, we're once again punting with a CR that has been written behind closed doors with no process and no opportunity for members to make their voices heard. Given this limited and truncated process, it's no wonder that many of my Republican colleagues have deep reservations about the bill we are considering today. Had the majority engaged in a more consultative and collaborative process, it might have resulted in a bill with more Republican buy-in in the House. Instead, we are left with a bill that many, if not most, of my Republican colleagues regard as woefully insufficient. Now, to be clear, there are many things in this bill that I support. I supported the omnibus spending bill we passed into law in March, and today's bill would extend spending at those levels. I support additional aid for Ukraine, and I support funding for disaster relief. But there are far too many things that this bill should do that it does not do. It does nothing to provide more funding for additional security infrastructure at the southern border, which is deeply concerning given the depth of the crisis there. The administration asked for, and this bill includes, $1.8 billion to assist migrants, but not a single new dollar to secure the southern border or to hire new border agents. The administration has fought hard to add new personnel in other areas of government, like hiring 87,000 new IRS employees, but they won't spend a dime on new agents to protect the southern border. The bill fails to address our energy crisis and does nothing to lower gas prices, develop new sources of energy, or move energy to markets. Not a single new drilling project or pipeline project will come online as a result of what we're doing today. There are plenty of things we can and should be doing to speed up energy exploration in this country. We see in Europe today the consequences of what happens when the supply of natural gas is artificially restricted, and we need to avoid that same fate. Most notably, this bill does nothing to address the inflation crisis or the recession that were caused by the Biden administration's reckless spending policies. All of these topics could and should have been addressed in the bill today, and that they are not is a disappointing state of affairs and a disservice to the American people. I also think it is long past time for this majority to get serious about the appropriations process. The Appropriations Committee, where I'm privileged to serve as the vice-ranking member, reported all 12 bills out of committee this summer, something I think both sides should be proud of. Just 6 of those bills, however, have come across the House floor, and in the Senate, which I would remind everyone is also controlled by the Democrats, not a single bill has even passed out of the Senate Appropriations Committee. Not a single one as of today, the day before government funding expires. To make matters worse, no serious bipartisan and bicameral negotiations have taken place, as will need to happen in order to deliver a full year funding. And in the meantime, what have we been doing here in the House? Passing one messaging bill after another out of the Rules Committee, bill after bill that won't pass the Senate and won't become law. To say that we are fiddling while Rome burns is an insult to Roman Emperor Nero. We just need to focus on the serious business of funding the government for the entire fiscal year. At the end of this process, bipartisan negotiations between the House and the Senate will have to take place on a full-year funding deal. And we know that 4 things will have to happen to reach that deal. First, defense spending will have to go up. The number the House passed out of the Appropriations Committee is wholly inadequate to meet America's defense needs. And we will ultimately have to reach the level of spending dictated by the Armed Services Committee that the House approved in the FY 2023 NDAA. Second, non-defense spending will have to come down. I know my friends on the other side of the aisle have more priorities than they have dollars to spend, and unfortunately, the non-defense appropriation titles were marked up at too high a level. Non-defense spending will have to come down to reach an agreement. Third, long-standing bipartisan pro-life policy provisions like the Hyde Amendment will have to go back in. These provisions have historically been carried in the annual appropriations measures for decades. Only for my friends in the majority to strip them out of the bills this year. But once again, these bills cannot become law unless these provisions are restored. Republicans will not vote for any deal otherwise. Finally, the 12 appropriations bills that passed out of the Appropriations Committee this year are rife with poison pills and progressive policy writers on topics ranging from climate change to labor regulations. We all know those will not be included in any final bipartisan agreement. Those will have to come out. We know the bill before us today will pass the House and be signed into law, But what we do not know is how successful we will be at negotiating a year-long deal if my friends in the majority don't get serious about actually negotiating. I fear we are currently on a collision course with a year-long CR, which is bad for the government, bad for the Congress, and bad for the American people. Whether the majority likes it or not, they will have to work with Republicans in both the House and the Senate to avoid that fate. I urge my friends to join us at the table, engage in serious negotiations, and reach a full-year spending deal without waiting until the last second again. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Well, thank you very much, and I just want to say for the record as well that I said over the CR in the Senate got over 60 votes. It actually got 72 votes, which is includes 22 Republicans, and I don't think any of us like CRs. We like a full omnibus bill passed and ready to go. But the only thing worse than a CR, I think, is shutting the government down. And when my friends were last in charge of the House and Senate and the White House, you shut the government down. And it was very, very costly. That was a terrible thing to do to the American people. And since the McGovern rule was invoked with regard to the 9/11 bill, let me just say for the record, I agree that this isn't an ideal process because basically, and because ideally, these payments would have been included in a larger bill, like similar payments have been in the past. Or we should have at least been considering this on suspension. It's fully paid for, and it shouldn't be controversial. Unfortunately, I'm told, Republicans have blocked this language for years, including blocking it from being included in the CR. So apparently, we can't trust that it will pass on a suspension, so here we are. So these families have been waiting for years for these payments, for years, and we need to get this done for them. And we are finally bringing this to the floor as a standalone measure, fully paid for, so that we can all show our support for the 9/11 families.
May I make?
Yeah, absolutely.
Whenever you're done. Oh, first of all, Mr. Chairman, all we're asking is that it be brought up before the last minute. That's not an unfair request. I actually will vote for the bill tomorrow. But I think you could have had a lot of bipartisan buy-in. It's your choice to handle it this way, not ours. And we have engaged repeatedly trying to do exactly what we're trying to achieve here. But it's the wrong way to do it. We all know it's the wrong way to do it. And we have a committee process for a reason, and that's so that good ideas can emerge in discussion and debate that can bring us together. That's not what's happened here. And that's not our fault. We're not the ones that set the timetable around here. The majority is. I respect that, but this should have come up a long time ago. So I suspect it will pass tomorrow. I hope it gets a good bipartisan vote. But the idea that we've done it this way, I think, is really, shameful. So we'll agree on the result. We're not going to agree about the process.
We agree on the result. At the end of the day, that's all that matters for these families. So I want to welcome our witnesses to provide testimony on Senate Amendment to H.R. 6833, Continuing Appropriations and Ukraine Supplemental Appropriations Act of 2023. Chairwoman DeLauro and Ranking Member Granger, we are delighted that you're here. I now recognize the gentlewoman from Connecticut, Chairwoman DeLauro.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. If I can just say one comment. I've had a family in Connecticut, the Eagleson family. Brett lost his dad. His mom lost her husband. And they have been years since 9/11 trying to get this done. And they come all of the time, and it's up to the last minute, and there's always something that is blocking it. These are the sons, the daughters, the mothers, the fathers of people who were lost on 9/11. It is a moral obligation for us to be able to take care of them. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Cole, thank you. On the members of the Rules Committee for the opportunity to appear before you to present H.R. 6833, the Continuing Appropriations and Ukraine Supplemental Act, which extends funding for critical federal programs and services through December 16th. In a 72-25 vote, the Senate approved this legislation with the support of all Democrats and 22 Republicans, including Senators Shelby and McConnell. I want to start by acknowledging the countless people across Florida, Puerto Rico, Alaska, and elsewhere reeling from recent disasters, stranded without power and other necessary resources, and mourning the loss of loved ones. This institution will stand with communities across the United States as they rebuild and recover from this devastation. Along with increasing natural disasters and extreme weather events, people all over our nation and the world face serious challenges, including the high cost of living, a war in Ukraine, increasing energy prices, and natural disasters raging through communities everywhere. Americans living paycheck to paycheck are struggling. The legislation before us today is a lifeline Americans need today. It provides assistance to families and communities in need, and it avoids disruptions to vital federal agencies, while guaranteeing the additional time for bipartisan, bicameral negotiations to enact final 2023 funding bills. But this is only a short-term solution. In March, Congress passed the 2022 government funding package with overwhelming bipartisan support. And this summer, the Appropriations Committee, as been stated, cleared 12, and the full House passed 6 2023 funding bills that ensure we live up to our responsibility to support Americans in the ways they need most. People in every corner of our nation, at every stage of their lives, are counting on us to pass these bills that lower costs, fight inflation, create American jobs, and support working families everywhere. Funding in the continuing resolution also guarantees we continue upholding our responsibility to the people of Ukraine in their fight against Russia's unprovoked invasion, which is an assault on democracy. Congress came together twice before to provide critical security and economic support for the Ukrainian people. While those funds have already been dispersed and are committed, the fight to protect global democracy in the face of Putin's authoritarianism is ongoing. For that reason, this bill provides $12.35 billion in assistance related to Ukraine, including $4.5 billion in economic assistance to directly help protect Ukraine's democracy and ensure its government services continue. We also include $3 billion for the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative to provide the equipment, training, and weapons that the Ukrainian military and national security forces need to continue protecting the Ukrainian people, and $1.5 billion to replenish U.S. stocks of equipment sent through drawdown authority. The bill also includes safeguards over these funds, such as a requirement of third-party monitoring and a certification by the Secretary of State that protects against corruption, with $2 million for the DoD Inspector General to monitor funds and provide Congress with a report inventorying security assistance. We ensure weapons are used for their intended purpose by their intended recipients. As a note, I might add, I met with Ukrainian parliamentarians yesterday, including the ambassador to the U.S., Ambassador Makarova, and I asked about the question of accountability. The Ukrainians now have barcoded the U.S. military equipment so they can track it, change it. They have in their parliament an accounting agency and one that is dealing with anti-corruption. So the Ukrainians are very, very much concerned, as we are, about accountability, and they've taken very serious steps to move forward. As we protect people around the world, we must also provide disaster relief to communities in this country who are reeling from the devastation of natural disasters, extreme weather events made worse by the climate crisis. This bill includes $20 million for previously authorized water infrastructure projects that can be used to address the crisis in Jackson, Mississippi, and support the hundreds of thousands of people who have been in desperate need of safe and clean water and water infrastructure for months. Our bill also includes $1 billion for the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program to help lower-income families cover the rising energy costs of home heating and cooling. With the full annual funding for the disaster relief included in this bill, we help protect the millions of Floridians, Puerto Ricans, and Alaskans suffering from the effects of a severe storm, flooding, and landslides. We provide $2.5 billion to address the largest wildfires in New Mexico history that were started by prescribed burns on federal land and got out of control. And as families struggle with the impact of floods, wildfires, major storms, droughts, and extreme heat, including in Puerto Rico, Alaska, Kentucky, California, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas, This bill provides $2 billion in community development block grant disaster relief to help rebuild housing and public infrastructure and to restore the economy in these affected communities. While I am saddened that aid necessary to combat the COVID pandemic and monkeypox outbreak were not included, the investments included in this bill are critical. As we continue working toward final full-year funding bills, this legislation will make a real difference in the lives of every American, strengthen our commitment to the Ukrainian people, and help Americans recover from recent natural disasters. I thank you, Chairman McGovern, Ranking Member Cole. I request an appropriate rule for floor consideration of H.R. 6833, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member Granger. Welcome.
Thank you, Chairman McGovern and Ranking Member Cole, for allowing me to testify on the Senate amendment to H.R. 6833, a short-term continuing resolution extending government funding through December the 16th. I oppose this CR for several reasons. First, it would be here addressing the border crisis, the energy crisis, and the inflation crisis, but this bill does nothing to fix any of these issues. In fact, this bill actually bails out the Biden administration for their failures and provides additional appropriations to put a Band-Aid on some of these problems with a few more months. Second, it's unfortunate this bill will be rushed through the House with just hours to spare to avoid a government shutdown. The American people continue to wonder why Congress can't get its job done until the very last minute and why we don't have more time to review legislation. Finally, I regret that because this CR only extends government funding to December the 16th, after the election, we'll be back in front of this committee again, trying to figure out a way forward. While this bill is an improvement over what the President proposed, I'm unable to give it my support. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you both. Mr. Cole.
Quickly, I want to thank both my friends, the distinguished chair and ranking member, for being here. What gives me the most hope is that they are here. They managed to work together last time and give us an omnibus bill that I was proud to vote for, and it was good give and take effort. I'm looking forward to that again. I'm sad, and I put this blame not on either of the two distinguished members in front of us, but on the Senate, first and foremost, and on, frankly, the majority leadership for not engaging in this discussion before. I agree with my friend, the ranking member. There's some other items that should have been considered here. It just, you know, we've been sitting up here with one messaging bill after another, electoral counts, stuff that we know is not going to happen because it hasn't been bipartisan. I know, left to their own devices, the chair and the ranking member will find common ground and will get us there. And I pledge to work with both of them to do that going forward as we have in the past. But I am just frustrated, Mr. Chairman, that this process is starting now. And I think that's deliberate on the part of the majority. They wait to the last minute. Again, we've talked about a lot of stuff up here we knew wasn't going to become law. This is the one thing that had to be done. Here we are on the eve of a government shutdown for the first time bringing it up. So I know my friends are in communication with one another. I respect that. They're both professionals. The staffs around them are both professionals. And I know we will get to a deal. I believe it. I'm determined to be optimistic despite the facts. But we can do better than this, and I hope in the future we will. But come the other side of the election, regardless of what happens in that, I pledge to my friend, the chair, and my friend, the ranking member, I'll be working with both of them. My friend, the chair, and I have 7 times in a row brought one of the most contentious bills through the process, and all 7 times we voted together for final passage of that bill. You know, we obviously did that, all 3 of us together, along with the members of the entire committee on the bill for this year. I'm confident under your leadership we can do it again. So, again, looking forward to working with you, but I'm sorry we're starting as late as we are in this process. With that, thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Mr. Perlmutter.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Good to see you too. As my days wind down here, I have two priorities, which you might get to hear about come December 16th. One of them is safe banking, which I have brought up from time to time. I will definitely, as we get to the end of the calendar, be pretty adamant about getting that passed. The second is something we've talked about a couple times in the Rules Committee. I haven't brought it to your attention, but it really is the compensation of the members of Congress, of the House of Representatives. And we used to be coupled with the judges for cost of living increases. But in 2009, we stopped providing ourselves cost of living increases. We did that to the judges. They sued us. They won. They've been able to get their cost of living adjustments, and they currently are at $224,000 a year for district judges, and we're at $174,000, so there's a $50,000 difference. So I intend to bring that up and see if I can't get it attached to something. And secondly, will be a housing allowance of some kind. Just want to alert my friends to the fact that I'm going to go down swinging on a lot of things, but those things in particular. With that, I yield back to the chair.
Thank you, and if my wife is watching, she'd want me to thank you. Dr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thanks to our witnesses for working so hard on this. I'm going to associate myself with the majority of the comments made by my ranking member, Mr. Cole. And I do regret the process, the way it has transpired. There is also a very significant problem on the border in the state of Texas. The governor of Texas has tried his best to respond and do the work of the federal government, and there is about a $4 billion price tag that Texas has paid doing the work of the federal government, which is securing the border. And so I'm disappointed that there is not any language in the bill that would begin to address that discrepancy in the money that I believe is owed to the state of Texas for the work that it's been doing. And the other thing, Mr. Chairman McGovern, you've heard me talk about this before. When we give up our ability to appropriate dollars to the agencies, we kind of cut ourselves out of any discussion with the cabinet heads, and it has been difficult. You've heard me complain about this before. It has been difficult to get phone calls answered, letters answered. It's been difficult to get an audience with cabinet secretaries, and it shouldn't be that way. We're the people's representatives, and we are spending the people's money. It's not money that inherently belongs to the government. It is the people's money, and we should have the ability to have that audience with agency heads. Now, what has brought this to a crisis in my district at home is the Veterans Administration just arbitrarily stopping an annex that was providing mental health services to veterans in Denton County. And it's inexplicable to me that that would happen. I hope to address this through the appropriations process. My understanding after digging into it a little bit is there has been money that you all have put in the regular veterans appropriations bills to build a new CBOC, outpatient clinic in Denton, and it's been there for years and it hasn't been spent. And I frankly do not understand why the head of the Veterans Administration will not defend to me about not spending that money. And I really don't understand how they can just simply withdraw a service that has been provided to the veterans in the community and just simply withdraw it and say, that's going to be okay, we're providing some telehealth instead. No, I'm sorry, that's not acceptable. There does need to be a face-to-face option. I've heard from veterans in the district who are suffering because of this, and it's not right. But all the time we give up our ability to appropriate dollars, authorize and appropriate dollars, we lose any leverage we have with agency heads. So I would just make that plea as we go forward, we have got to do a better job. Yes, us as authorizers, yes, as appropriators, and we've got to hold the agencies accountable for delivering for the people that we represent. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Other than that, I don't have any questions.
Mrs. Torres, do you have any?
I just want to take a moment to thank both of you. We had a very robust appropriations process. It is unfortunate that, we must continue to fund the federal government through a CR, but unfortunately that is where we are. I'm a bit disappointed that we are not seeing funding to address the ongoing health crisis, including the COVID-19 pandemic and the monkeypox outbreak. It really is a telling story of the priorities between Republicans and Democrats, even in the CR, where they just refuse to meet us in the middle to fund the basic health crisis that we are seeing before us. But shutting down the federal government, it is not an option. So I am glad that we are here today with this CR. Thank you for working, hard to bring it to us. And with that, I support it and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Reschenthaler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We just heard talk about a health crisis. We've got a fentanyl crisis. I could go through the stats. We all know they're staggering. Ranking Member Granger, what is in this CR to combat the issue we have with fentanyl?
It's a continuing issue because there's a disagreement in how we should approach that, how much we should do, but it's leaving particularly our young people, at a huge risk. Very difficult. Thank you.
Thanks. I'd like to just associate my remarks with the ranking member, and for the sake of time, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Not me? Okay.
The
The ranking.
I'm sorry. I'm associating my remarks with the ranking member,
Oh, okay.
but I'm yielding back to you, Mr.
Okay. Oh, thank you very much. Mr. Raskin.
I just want to thank the gentleladies for their presentations and yield back.
Ms. Fischbach.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I don't want to ask any questions, just want to just associate myself with the remarks of the ranking member, just to be clear, and just, talk a little bit about the increases that are here. This just extends it, and there are significant increases from the previous year. So just a concern about that, and I understand, the argument of shutting down the government, but we've had a lot of time to look at those appropriations bills and do our real work. This is just, a quick fill, and until December 16th. And so disappointed that the majority has not been able to actually do the budgeting that needed to be done. And with that, I'll yield back.
I think Ms. Scanlon.
I just wanted to associate myself with the thanks to our Appropriations Committee for pushing through as many bills as you've been able to so far. Wish the Senate could keep up and that we didn't have to resort to a CR, but look forward to voting for it on the floor. I yield back.
Mr. DeSagne. Ms. Ross.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be extremely brief. Just wanted to again reiterate that while this is a CR, we are providing much-needed relief to communities devastated by recent hurricanes and other disasters like the New Mexico wildfires, and we are bolstering our support for our Ukrainian allies as they face a final concerted push from Russian military forces. And so we have taken care of some emergency situations in this CR. I commend the chairwoman, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Neguse. Okay. All right, thank you. Anyone else with any questions? Seeing none? You're free to go. Thank you very much.
Thank you all very much.
Appreciate it.
Appreciate your time.
From any amendment, we will hear from any amendment witnesses on the Senate amendment to H.R. 6833 at the end of the hearing portion of today's meeting. I'd now like to welcome our witnesses to provide testimony on H.R. 8987, the Fairness for 9/11 Families Act. Chairman Nadler and Representative Massey, we're delighted that you were here. I now recognize the gentleman from New York, Chairman Nadler.
Thank you. Chairman McGovern, Ranking Member Cole, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify about H.R. 8987, the Fairness for 9/11 Families Act. This legislation would provide a catch-up payment to thousands of 9/11 victims, spouses, and dependents who were unfairly excluded from the U.S. Victims of State-Sponsored Terrorism Fund when it was first established in 2015. While no amount of money can ever make up for the incalculable loss that they suffered on September 11th, this legislation would ensure that they are fairly compensated for their claims against those responsible for one of our nation's darkest days. In 2015, Congress created the United States Victims of State-Sponsored Terrorism. terrorism fund, I should say, to provide compensation for individuals with terrorism judgments against designated state sponsors of terrorism. At the time, those who had received payments from the September 11th Victim Compensation Fund, primarily victims' spouses and children, were precluded from receiving funds from the VSSTF. Their exclusion from the fund led to a perverse result by which other family members who were not eligible for payments under the VCF could receive compensation from the VSSTF, in some cases substantially more than what was paid out under the VCF, while victims' spouses and children were excluded from the fund despite also having claims. Congress corrected this injustice in 2019, and a year later it tasked the Government Accountability Office with calculating a lump sum catch-up payment that would bring those who initially had been wrongly excluded from the VSSTF into parity with those individuals who had been included in the fund when it was first created. The Fairness for 9/11 Families Act fully funds these catch-up payments, offset by funds no longer needed to implement the Paycheck Protection Program. When our nation was attacked on September 11th, we made a commitment on that terrible day to support the victims and their families. This legislation honors that commitment. I want to thank Senators Menendez and Schumer for their partnership on this legislation and for all of their efforts to provide justice and support to 9/11 families over the years. I also want to thank the many victims and family members whose advocacy and determination were essential to bringing this legislation forward. Although nothing can make up for 20 years of missed birthdays, anniversaries, and memories for those who lost loved ones on September 11th, hope that these funds can provide some measure of comfort and justice to the people whose lives were changed forever that day. I urge all members to support the Fairness for 9/11 Families Act, and I would be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you. Mr. Massey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a bill that we've not marked up in committee and wasn't even introduced until earlier this week. 9/11 victims and families have long been a bipartisan majority or priority for Congress. And honestly, I think they deserve a hearing. This bill does deserve a hearing in the Judiciary Committee. We don't want to do this half-baked. It shouldn't be written by people who aren't congressmen, who aren't in contact with these families. And I'm worried that this doesn't represent our best work. The Victims of State-Sponsored Terrorism Fund provides payments to those Americans with legal judgments against state sponsors of terror for acts of terrorism. These are individuals who have gone to court and received a judgment against countries like Iran and North Korea. The VSST fund is able to make these payments through the enforcement of sanctions against bad actors. Once a sufficient amount of money has been collected in the fund, the special master makes disbursements to eligible claimants based on a pro rata formula established by Congress. Because of how and when certain 9/11 claimants gained access to the fund, they have received less than other 9/11 claimants. According to the GAO study required by Congress, this shortfall amounts to $2.7 billion. This bill will use taxpayer dollars to remedy that shortfall. I want to make it clear at this point, I'm speaking for myself as a member of the committee and not necessarily the whole committee, but I've talked to some of these victims, and I wonder why there is a shortfall in this fund and why we can't get the money for them. A lot of them have asked me why Saudi Arabia, whose actors were complicit in helping the hijackers carry out these heinous acts, why isn't the state government of Saudi Arabia eligible to be sued by the claimants, by those families of the victims of this heinous act? And they asked me the same questions. I'm not proposing that they should be added to the list of victims of state-sponsored terrorism of the states that sponsor terrorism, but why are we talking about Iran and North Korea, that fund, as a source of funds, or even the taxpayer, when we have a country, 15 of the 19 hijackers were from that country, but more importantly, and this, you can go in the SCIF and you can confirm this stuff, we know there were actors of the Saudi Arabian government who supported this. I'm not saying they're state sponsor of terrorism, but even if it's unwittingly that the government facilitated this heinous attack, they should be liable. And I think there should be more money for these families. And that's the kind of thing, if we had had a hearing in judiciary, we could have vetted that. We could have had people to come and talk about that. We could have had victims come and talk about that very issue. But that's not the case with this bill. All members of Congress are sympathetic to the trauma and harm these families have suffered. And let me just reiterate, I think in his opening remarks, the ranking member said that he intends to vote for this. I imagine a lot of us will. What we're here today to talk about is the rule and the process and how we could have done better, I think. The lives were shattered more than 20 years ago in a senseless act of terrorism. Chairman Nadler and others have pushed a similar proposal for the past few years. However, over that time, the time when Chairman Nadler controlled the Judiciary Committee, we've not had a hearing or marked up legislation on this matter. There's been no outreach or attempt to find a bipartisan solution. Notably, when other potential source of funds for these catch-up payments became available, Chairman Nadler was silent. In February 2022, President Biden issued an executive order seizing approximately $7 billion of Afghan assets held in the United States. The executive order directed approximately half of those funds to be used for humanitarian assistance in Afghanistan and allowed a small subset of 9/11 plaintiffs to attempt to satisfy their legal claims against the Taliban. Who was this small subset of 9/11 plaintiffs that was given this opportunity? And why were they given this opportunity? Maybe it had something to do with their lawyer. Lee Wolosky spent 4 months as a special counsel to President Biden between September 2021 and January 2022. During that time, he worked on matters related to Afghanistan and its collapse. Just days after leaving the White House, Wolosky identified himself as counsel to the small group of 9/11 plaintiffs who stood to benefit from that $3.5 billion earmarked by President Biden. Republican members sent a letter to the White House seeking information about this apparently corrupt arrangement, but we have received no response. Some members have raised the possibility of using that seized money to benefit the broader collection of 9/11 claimants, rather than a small politically connected subset of 9/11 plaintiffs. Instead, this proposal uses tax dollars to make up the shortfall. Democrats may argue that this proposal is paid for with an offset, but that's a simple sleight of hand. The money would be taken from COVID relief money that Congress appropriated for small businesses. There are potential solutions to this problem other than the one put forward by the chairman. Unfortunately, because Chairman Nadler has declined to allow the Judiciary Committee to consider these other possibilities, we are left with just the bill before us today. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I just want to quickly respond. I want to thank my friend and the chair for being here to testify. As I said, I certainly intend to vote for this legislation, but I agree with my friend from Kentucky. This is not the ideal solution, and this is a terrible process. There were other alternatives. I think we could have found a bipartisan agreement on this. This is not something that divides us. We all agree these victims deserve a remedy, but it needs to be a thoughtful remedy, and it needs to be appropriated or funded from the appropriate source. We've had no chance to explore that, no chance to discuss that, no chance to present alternatives that our own friends on the other side might have found attractive. So this short-circuiting of the process is just, to put it bluntly, no way to run a railroad. So I regret the process very, very much. And I think we'll look back on this as a missed opportunity to do the right thing and, frankly, to make sure others that are more responsible for this than the American taxpayer, we're paying part of the bill. So I'll have more to say on that when we discuss the matter. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mrs. Torres. Dr. Burgess.
No specific questions, but I thank you, Mr. Massey, for bringing your perspective to the Rules Committee. And you were unable to get the questions answered as far as contingent liability by another country. I hope you will pursue that in the next Congress, because I do think it's important. Thank you, and I'll yield back.
Mr. Bromoter.
Thank our witnesses and yield back.
Mr. Reshethaw.
Thank our witnesses, and I yield back.
Mr. Raskin.
Thank our witnesses and Chairman Nadler for your hard work. Yield back.
Ms. Fishbach.
I have to thank our witnesses and yield back. Thank you.
We're on a roll.
Ms. Scanlon.
I associate myself with Ms. Fishbach's remarks.
We get, Mr. Desagne, Ms. Ross. Mr. Neguse. Okay, any other questions? If not, thank you very much. You are free to go.
Thank you.
Are there any other members that wish to testify on HR 8987? Seeing none, that closes the hearing on 8987. All right, I want to now welcome our next panel to testify on amendments, Representative McClintock and Representative Rose. Let me recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, first.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The amendment that Mr. Biggs and I have submitted would restore order and legitimacy to the U.S. asylum system, and I'd urge you to make it in order. When Donald Trump left office, we'd restored operational control of our border. The wall was nearing completion, court-ordered deportations were finally being enforced, migrant protection protocols negotiated with Mexico and other administrative steps by the Trump administration had reduced the number of fraudulent asylum claims to a trickle. All that Joe Biden needed to do was continue these policies. Instead, he reversed them on his first day in office. In doing so, he sent a clear and unmistakable message heard around the world: America is now a nation without borders. And the results are staggering. In 20 months, more than 3.6 million illegal aliens have been encountered on the southwest border. Well over 1 million have been deliberately admitted into our country and trafficked across it at taxpayer expense. While the Border Patrol was overwhelmed processing this mass illegal migration, another 1 million or more entered without ever encountering the Border Patrol. In 20 months, we have thus added an impoverished, dependent, and illegal population larger than the populations of Alaska, South Dakota, Vermont, and Rhode Island combined. No civilization has survived a mass migration of this magnitude. A Gallup reports there are 42 million people living in poverty in Latin America and the Caribbean who want to come to the United States, and now they are. Aliens know that if they can just make it to the southern border, they can claim a fear of persecution, however fraudulent. After that, the Biden administration will simply release them into the U.S. to await their years-long immigration court process. And as an extra gift, Joe Biden will also give them a work permit. There's simply no downside to coming here. Meritless asylum claims make a mockery of the U.S. immigration system and of our humanitarian immigration programs that seek to help those who need protection. They strain the immigration court system and enrich the Mexican smuggling cartels. Congressional Democrats have ignored this self-inflicted debacle for too long. The immigration court caseload is now an unprecedented 1.9 million cases, nearly half of which are asylum claims. Only a small number of aliens who have been found to have a credible fear of persecution are actually found by immigration judges to be eligible for asylum. For instance, in fiscal year 2021, only 14% of aliens in removable cases that originated with a credible fear claim were granted asylum. That same percent for fiscal year 2020 was 16.5, not that much higher. So what does that mean? It means that most of the cases in which aliens are found initially to have credible fear end up not being eligible for asylum. The meritless cases take up scarce resources and time in immigration courts and add to the long waiting times for legitimate asylum claims. One answer is to preclude aliens who can seek asylum in other countries from being able to seek asylum in the U.S. absent certain exceptions. The amendment Mr. Biggs and I have proposed does exactly that. Simply says that an alien is not eligible for asylum in the U.S. if the alien has passed through a safe third country in which he or she could apply for asylum. There are certain exceptions. For instance, if the alien did apply for and was denied asylum in that safe third country, then the alien can apply for asylum here. If the alien is being trafficked, he or she can apply for asylum here. And if the alien only transited through countries that were not parties to certain international protocols, that came out of the 1957 Refugee Convention or the Convention Against Torture, they can also apply for asylum here. The goal is not to cut off access to asylum in the U.S., but rather it is to make reasonable changes to U.S. law that will rein in the recent explosion of meritless claims. If that happens, fewer migrants will make the dangerous journey to the U.S. because they will know that they'll not simply get a free pass to wait in the U.S. for years. The cartels will also stop making money off of migrants who often become victims of rape and other violent crimes and to mortal dangers in the desperate trip to get here. And legitimate asylum seekers can have their day in court expeditiously. There's much that Congress could do to restore integrity to our asylum system and in turn to our nation's borders. The changes made by our amendment are just the start, but it would be a highly effective start. And I'd urge you to make this amendment in order.
Thank you. Mr. Rose.
Thank you, Chairman McGovern and Ranking Member Cole and members of the committee for allowing me to provide testimony on H.R. 6833, the Continuing Appropriation and Supplemental Appropriations Act of 2023. As I'm sure you're aware, the bill we are here to discuss would provide $12.3 billion in supplemental appropriations to the country of Ukraine for economic and military aid as they bravely fend off Russian aggression. I want to start by saying I am supportive of these efforts to assist Ukraine. There is no doubt that Ukraine is fighting this battle on the front lines on behalf of the entire world. I commend the Ukrainians for their courage and bravery and believe we should do everything reasonably possible to support them in their efforts. However, as a fiscal conservative, I believe that we should pay for this assistance for Ukraine with funds that already exist, not new debt. As the bill currently exists, the $12.3 billion in aid for Ukraine is not paid for. Instead, the U.S. government, which is already in debt to the tune of nearly $31 trillion, will incur $12.3 billion in more debt to pay for this provision in the bill. I believe that if assisting Ukraine is something we want to do, we ought to find a way to pay for it instead of putting it off for future generations to figure out. It is wildly irresponsible for Congress to continue to mortgage our children and grandchildren's future for the sake of these decisions. That is why I am proposing an amendment that would pay for the assistance to Ukraine by transferring $12.3 billion originally destined for the IRS from the Inflation Reduction Act and rescind the remaining $67.3 billion provided to the IRS, which would be used for a number of things, among them to hire thousands of new IRS agents. If we truly support Ukraine, we should be paying for the assistance with already existing funds, not new funds incurred by taking out new debt. This amendment would do exactly that. I ask you all to support my amendment and include it in the final version of the bill so that we can put an end to this irresponsible way of governing and work towards restoring our fiscal house to order. Thank you, and I look forward to answering any questions. I yield back to the chair.
Yeah, thank you. I think I'm going to not have any questions. Mr. Cole?
I have no questions, but I do want to say, Mr. Chairman, I support both amendments being made in order. I think it's important for us to have this discussion on the House floor. Thank you.
Mr. Torres? Dr. Burgess?
Yeah, just a question for the gentleman from California. You referenced the monetization of the movement of people illegally into this country. Do you have a ballpark figure as to what is the effect of that monetization that is being carried out?
You're speaking of what are the cartels
Yes, what are
making
the
by this mass smuggling? It's in the billions of dollars. I don't have the exact figure off the top of my head.
I'll follow up with you. I think that would be interesting to know that.
Well, I'm told the smuggling rates are increasing, that they range from $4,000 or $5,000 up to $20,000 or more if people are being brought in from places like China or Eastern Europe.
And Mr. Rose, thank you for bringing your amendment. I agree with you. I think we should do things and pay for them if they're worthwhile. I will also share with you, although I voted in favor of the aid to Ukraine several months ago, I have been disappointed the administration has not kept us up to date with what their thinking is. Remember, we had the briefing prior to the Russian invasion, and then we didn't even have another briefing until the end of July, And then it was not with the Secretary, it was not Secretary Blinken, it was not General Austin, it was not General Milley, it was undersecretaries and assistants. And really, Congress should not be treated with so much disrespect by the administration. If this is important, bring the experts in here and let us hear from them. And then by all means, let us pay for what we do. Thank you.
Mr. Perlmutter.
Thanks. Just a comment to my friend, Mr. Rose. You know, and I appreciate your concern on the $30 trillion in debt, but, you know, you and I had all those bank CEOs in front of us a few days ago. And, you know, 30 trillion as compared to what? And it's not quite apples to apples, but the testimony that day is J.P. Morgan Chase in one day processes 10 trillion, and you take those other 7 big banks, they do close to $30 trillion a day in processing financial transactions, worldwide, obviously. But the numbers sometimes, when you say 30 trillion, you know, it seems like it's a number that's staggering to any one of us. But the economy of this country and the economy of the world is gigantic. And it's always got to be as compared to what. And I'm happy to have my friend respond, but mostly it's just a comment.
And I appreciate that comment, and certainly we are blessed to have a very robust world economy and by so many measures. But I think by all estimations, the 31 trillion, almost 31 trillion in debt, by any of the historic measures, is a real burden upon the future generations of this country. And I think we see that illustrated most explicitly with the rising cost of the interest burden that we're going to face as interest rates rise, which very quickly has the potential to consume the entire discretionary side of our budget over the next many months as those interest rates rise. And so I think at some point we have to, as a nation, decide to prioritize. And frankly, I think when we ask the American people to pay for things like this, they need to be vested in the challenges that we take on as a country. And I think we've seen this over the last 20 years, that very often when we don't ask the American people to make a real sacrifice for the
Good of the future.
foreign entanglements that we get into, that it is counterproductive for the country.
All right, I thank the gentleman. I yield back.
Let me just say, Mr. Rose, I in principle agree with you. We've had this discussion going back to the Iraq War, to the Afghanistan War, about the need for people to pay for these wars. I even suggested a war tax at one point. I just find it a little bit ironic that you go after cut the IRS for two reasons. One is that we want to make sure that people pay their taxes, because that can help reduce our debt, the money we claim. There's lots of people that get away with not paying taxes, number one. Number two, I have constituents who have not gotten their refunds. They've waited and waited and waited and waited because there's such a backlog. And so they're anxious for us to provide funding for the IRS so they can get the money that's entitled to them and have it not dragged out. But in any event, in general, I agree with the concept that we ought to pay for these wars, and that if we're going to be involved in wars, you know, especially, well, in this case, we don't have American troops fighting in this war, but especially we have American troops fighting in this war. They're the only ones who are sacrificing. We all should sacrifice in that case. But Mr. Reschenthal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Do any of the witnesses have anything that you'd like to add? You're good? All right. Well, I just want to say that I hope both your amendments are made in order, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Raskin.
No questions, thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Scanlon. Oh, I'm sorry, Ms. Fishbach.
I'm down here still. I'm quiet, but I'm down here. No, I have no questions. I yield back.
Ms. Scanlon.
No questions.
Mr. Morelli. Okay, all right. Mr. Desagne. Ms. Ross. Mr. Neguse.
No questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Anybody else have any questions for this panel?
You
Hearing
folks
none,
were
thank
much more chatty the last time I was here.
I just want to know what Mr. Morelli's eating, that's all.
You are free to go. Thank you very much. Are there any of the members who wish to testify in Senate Amendment to H.R. 6833? Seeing none, this closes the hearing on Senate Amendment to H.R. 6833. At this time, the chair will entertain a motion from the distinguished gentleman from California, Mr. Torres. And we need, Mrs. Torres.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move the committee grant a rule providing for the consideration of the Senate amendment to H.R. 6833, the Continuing Appropriations in Ukraine Supplemental Appropriations Act of 2023. The rule makes in order a motion offered by the chair of the Committee on Appropriations or her designee that the House concur in the Senate amendment to H.R. 6833. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the motion and the Senate amendment. The rule provides that the Senate amendment and the motion shall be considered as read. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate on the motion, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Appropriations or their designees. The rule provides further for the consideration of H.R. 8987, the Fairness for 9/11 Families Act, under a closed rule. The rule provides 1 hour of debate, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on the Judiciary or their designees. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill, and the rule provides that an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 117-68 shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. And finally, the bill provides 1 motion to recommit.
So you've heard the motion from the gentleman from California. Any discussion or amendment? Okay. With that, hearing none, the question is now on the motion for the gentlewoman from California. All those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed will say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Recorded vote has been requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Torres. Aye. Mrs. Torres, aye. Mr. Perlmutter.
Aye.
Mr. Perlmutter, aye. Mr. Raskin.
Aye.
Mr. Raskin, aye. Ms. Scanlon.
Aye.
Ms. Scanlon, aye. Mr. Morelli.
Morelli is aye.
Mr. Morelli, aye. Mr. DeSagne.
Aye.
Mr. DeSagne, aye. Ms. Ross. Aye. Ms. Ross, aye. Mr. Neguse.
Aye.
Mr. Neguse, aye. Mr. Cole. No. Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, no. Mr. Rushenthaler. Mr. Rushenthaler, no. Mrs. Fishbach. No. Mrs. Fishbach, no. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
Clerk report the total.
9 yeas, 4 nays.
The motion is agreed to. I will handle it for the Democrats. And we will probably be meeting, we are meeting we're coming in at 9 a.m., so, on the floor. Mrs. Torres has a question.
I just want to extend an invitation to all of the committee members to join me at 10 a.m. tomorrow with McGruff, the crime, the crime dog. Take a bite out of crime, everybody.
Hold my breath for that one. Yeah. Okay, good. No,
10 a.m.
without objection, the committee is adjourned.